Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7. I'm glad to have you with me today for another discussion of military history. Today we're going to continue our look at the SBD Dauntless dive bomber and the battles in which it played a major role. Today we'll return to the Southwest Pacific and examine the two large carrier battles that were fought here as part of the Solomons campaign. These hard-fought clashes of naval aviators were the last rounds in the critical battles fought among the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago in the first year of the war. My sources for this one will be Douglas SBD Dauntless by Peter C. Smith and SBD Dauntless Units of World War II by Barrett Tillman. For some info on the Japanese flying boats, I'll be using Kawanishi 4-motor flying boats by M.C. Richards, number 233 in the Aircraft Profile series. So with that said, let's get back to the waters of the Southwest Pacific, in this case the body of water to the north and east of the Solomons chain, where the evenly matched battle squadrons of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet were engaged in a long struggle for control of the sea here. First of the two major carrier versus carrier battles fought in connection with the land battle on Guadalcanal was fought almost as soon as the airfield on the island had received its first American aircraft. As we have seen in a previous episode, this airstrip had been taken soon after the initial landings of the Marines on the 7th of August. At the time of the capture, the facility was still under construction by the Japanese. It would take almost exactly 2 weeks for the Americans to secure the perimeter from the repeated Japanese counterattacks, put the field into shape to operate combat planes. First planes to be based here, Marine Dauntlesses and Wildcat fighters from squadrons VMSB-232 and VMF-223, were flown to the field from the deck of the escort carrier USS Long Island on the 20th. These Marine aviators, under the command of Major Richard Mangrum, were the beginning of the American air presence on the embattled island. The American code name for Guadalcanal was Cactus, and as a result, the bombers and fighters operating from the island became known as the Cactus Air Force. The Marines on the island were not unsupported. The Southwest Pacific Theater was clearly the decisive point in the war against Japan, and the bulk of the U.S. Navy's fleet carrier strength was concentrated there. This consisted of 3 big fleet carriers, the Enterprise, the Wasp, and the Saratoga, under the command of Vice Admiral Fletcher. Each of these ships formed the nucleus of a task group, including cruisers and destroyers and in some cases battleships. Fletcher flew his flag aboard the Saratoga, which led Task Force 11, including the heavy cruisers New Orleans and Minneapolis, as well as 5 destroyers. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, is built around the Enterprise and the battleship North Carolina, and screened by the cruisers Portland and Atlanta and 6 destroyers. Rear Admiral Leah Knowles led Task Force 18, with the Wasp, along with the cruisers Salt Lake City, San Francisco, and San Juan, 7 more destroyers. In addition to these purely American groups, a squadron of mixed American and Australian vessels was also operating in the area. This was known as Task Force 44, under the command of the Australian Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, his flag aboard the heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. Task Force 44 also included the Australian cruisers Canberra and Hobart, U.S. cruiser Chicago, and 8 American destroyers. This group was mainly engaged in convoy escort duties between the Australian mainland and the battle zones in the Solomons and on New Guinea. By the end of August, Task Force 44 was operating in conjunction with Task Force 18 and the Wasp. Each of the American carriers operated an air group of 4 squadrons. One of these was a fighter squadron with between 27 and 29 F-4F Wildcats, a torpedo bomber squadron with 13 to 15 TBF Avengers, and 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntlesses, each with a strength of between 15 and 18 planes. Each pair of Dauntless squadrons was divided into a scout unit and a dive bomber unit, designated respectively by the prefix VS or VB. According to pre-war Navy doctrine, the scouting squadrons were intended to operate in a reconnaissance capacity, while the bombing squadrons proper specialized in the dive bombing role. But by this point in the war, both kinds operated more or less interchangeably. Altogether, then, the 3 American carriers had a total of 103 Dauntlesses aboard. After the initial battles on the island of Guadalcanal, the Japanese had made an effort to reinforce their weak forces in the area and to throw the American invasion back into the sea. They had sent a crack force of infantry to carry out this counterattack. This was the so-called Ichiki Detachment, named, like many other ad hoc battle groups in the Second World War, after its commanding officer. Japanese high command had seriously underestimated the strength of the American force on the island, however, and as a result the Ichiki Detachment, less than 1,000 strong, was too small to tackle the 3,000 U.S. Marines already establishing themselves on the island. As a result, They were all but annihilated in a characteristically determined attack against the airfield and the beachheads in the early morning hours of the 21st of August. Nothing daunted, the Japanese High Command sent another, slightly larger force, drawn from the Army and the Special Naval Landing Force, which was the Japanese Marines, to repeat the attempt. The reinforcement convoy was commanded by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. This man would earn the respect and the nickname of Tenacious Tanaka from his American enemies, a rare honor in this normally very bitter conflict. Troops were sent aboard 3 cargo vessels and 4 smaller patrol ships. These transports were provided with a close escort of 8 destroyers led by Tanaka's flagship, the light cruiser Jinsu. These were also able to call upon a more distant covering group under Admiral Mikawa. This was composed of 4 heavy cruisers, the Chokai, the Ioba, the Furutaka, and the Kinugasa. These cruisers were there to protect the convoy in case of intervention by heavy Allied surface forces, and had the secondary mission of bombarding Henderson Field by night. In addition to these dedicated escort groups, the small troop convoy was supported by another strong group of naval forces. Together, these represented the greater part of Japanese naval strength in the area. Japanese Naval Command, as usual, was seeking a decisive battle of annihilation with the American naval forces in the area, and hoped to use the convoy mission as bait to lure them into a major confrontation. This operation was codenamed Ka by the Japanese Navy. It was the brainchild of Admiral Ishiroku Yamamoto. Characteristically, the plan was elaborate and complex, the forces involved not concentrated, but split up into a number of independently operating squadrons. 2 major surface forces were deployed in addition to the convoy and its escorts. These included the so-called Main Body Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. This was composed of 2 cruiser squadrons with a total of 5 heavy cruisers: the Itago, Maya, Takayo, Miyoko, and Haguro, supported by the seaplane carrier Chitose, deployed here to launch scout float planes. The heavy cruiser force was screened by 5 destroyers led by the light cruiser Yura. The major concentration of surface firepower was found in the second big service group, so-called Vanguard Group, under the command of Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe. This was made up of the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Kumano, Suzuya, and Shikuma, and a screening group composed of the light cruiser Nagara and 6 destroyers. This powerful squadron was intended to penetrate to the islands and engage the American squadrons in the area in a decisive night action. The guns of the battleships would, as we have seen in a previous episode, prove to be one of the biggest hazards to the growing American air strength on Guadalcanal when employed in devastating night bombardments. More important for the unfolding battle were the 2 Japanese carrier forces involved. The largest, the striking group, under the veteran carrier commander Nagumo, consisted of the large carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku with a screen of 6 destroyers. These 2 big carriers had aboard the remainder of the elite Japanese Naval Air Force that had devastated the Allies in the Central Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and in the Southwest Pacific for the first months of the war, until their decisive check at Midway. Between them, the 2 carriers brought a strong air group of 54 Mitsubishi A6M Type 0 fighters, 54 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, and 36 Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bombers. Proceeded in company with the heavy surface vessels of the Vanguard Force. A smaller carrier force designated the Diversionary Group was commanded by Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara. This included the light carrier Rujo, the heavy cruiser Tone, and a pair of destroyers. This group was positioned to provide air cover to Tanaka's troop convoy and was sent somewhat ahead and to the west of the larger carrier force, on a course to reach Guadalcanal from the northwest. It may thus have been intended by Yamamoto to be discovered first and act as bait to draw the Americans' attention while the other Japanese forces approached. The Ryujo operated an air group of 24 fighters and 9 torpedo planes. This made a total of 177 Japanese carrier aircraft included in Yamamoto's total force. More Japanese ships were also at sea. The armada was backed up by a support group consisting of the battleship Mutsu, the light carrier Junyo, and 3 destroyers. Yamamoto himself was also at sea, aboard his flagship, the massive super-dreadnought battleship Yamato, in company with the light carrier Taiyo and a pair of destroyers. Neither of these battleship forces were dispatched to the battle area, and they played no part in the action. In addition to the carrier planes, the Japanese cruisers carried a considerable number of catapult float planes, which, under Japanese naval doctrine, were responsible for the fleet's reconnaissance, leaving the full strength of their carrier air wings available for strike missions. This difference in scouting doctrine usually conferred an advantage on the Japanese, which were almost always able to locate American forces and launch an initial strike before they themselves had been located. It also allowed the Japanese more flexibility in the use of their carriers, which would not need to spend time or make course changes in order to launch and recover scout planes as well as strike groups and fighter patrols. Both sides were also able to call on land-based aircraft, the Americans having PBY Catalina reconnaissance flying boats in the nearby islands, and some B-17 flying fortresses available at Espiritu Santo. The Japanese had the 25th and 26th Air Flotillas in striking range, with a force of about 40 G4M Betty twin-engine bombers and 50 A6M Zero fighters, as well as a small number of dive bombers and reconnaissance planes. On paper, then, the Americans outmatched the Japanese 3-2 in carrier planes. The Japanese naval aviators involved were the remainder of their elite, highly trained pre-war cadres, the majority of which had been incinerated or sent to the bottom in the battles of the last few months of 1942. In general, these crews were superior in skill and experience to their relatively green American counterparts, though this advantage was somewhat less pronounced than it would have been at the time of Coral Sea or Midway. The Japanese also held a decisive superiority in surface ships, almost 2-1, though these were divided among a large number of squadrons operating out of supporting distance from one another. However, the experience earlier in the year had shown that the possession of a larger force of surface warships gave a fleet little more than a greater number of targets to offer to an enemy, equipped with effective strike planes like the Dauntless and in control of the air. The action that has become known to history as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons was set in motion on the 23rd, just 3 days after Mangram's planes landed at Henderson Field. American carriers were located about 150 miles or 240 kilometers to the east of Malaita Island, heading north-northeast up the eastern side of the island group, headed right for the oncoming Japanese, who were approaching from the north. Both fleets had scouts in the air, groping in the dawn light for the ships of the other side. The Japanese had deployed lines of submarines along the likely route of the American ships, and it was one of these that the Dauntlesses flying on these early morning air patrols first found. Lieutenant Turner F. Caldwell and Ensign Harold L. Buell from Scouting 5, armed with 500-pound or 227-kilogram bombs, spotted a submarine running south on the surface at 0725 hours. The lieutenant made an attack dive on her. The submarine's lookout spotted the Americans, however, and the vessel crashed over. The lieutenant's bomb impacted the sea some distance away abeam the conning tower as the sub went down, and it is unlikely that the sub was damaged by this attack. The regular 500-pound bomb was relatively ineffective against the stout pressure hulls of a submarine unless a direct hit was achieved. As a result, SBDs on anti-submarine patrol were usually fitted with 325-pound or 147-kilogram depth bombs, which are much more deadly to underwater targets. A more tempting target was found shortly after 0950 hours when a PBY Catalina flying boat, flying from New Delhi in the nearby Santa Cruz Islands, reported a Japanese naval force headed south towards the islands from the direction of their base at Raval. This, in fact, was Tanaka's transport column. A pair of American strike groups were launched, one from the deck of the Saratoga and the other from Henderson Field, to attack these ships. Tanaka, however, had reversed course once he learned that the American scout plane had spotted his force, and the Dauntlesses found only empty ocean. The course reversal put him behind schedule for the planned landing of his embarked troops, but very likely saved some of his ships from damage or destruction at the hands of the dive bombers, which would have found them without air cover. The rest of the approaching Japanese armada had so far remained undiscovered, and the Americans remained unaware of the extent of the danger that was closing in on them. As a result, the Wasp, along with the rest of Task Force 18, was withdrawn from the Guadalcanal area and sent to Atafi Island to refuel. This Allied base was a 2-day voyage away to the south, and as a result, the Wasp, along with her air group and her escorting warships, would not take part in this battle. This decision cost the Americans their superiority in carrier aircraft, leaving them with 176, one less than the total number embarked on the Japanese ships. The next day, things began early. Hara's diversionary group, built around the Rujo, was tasked with giving air cover to Tanaka's convoy. It was heading southwest towards the gap between Santa Isabel and Malaita Islands. From this position, they would be approaching the battle zone around Guadalcanal from the west. The main carrier and surface combat forces were some distance to the northeast of this group, and were heading south towards the eastern end of Malaita, approaching Guadalcanal from the other side. The Ryujo's air group was detailed to launch a dawn raid against the Marine squadrons at Henderson Field. This was part of Yamamoto's plan to draw away the attention of the American carrier aircraft from the main portion of his armada. He hoped this would allow the striking group to remain undetected until the scout planes located the American fleet and allowed him to get in the first blow. The big carriers of the striking group had their planes armed and ready to take off at a moment's notice. Heavy ships of the Vanguard Force, along with Kondo's cruisers, were deployed a short distance from the carrier group. These ships pushed steadily southwards, hoping to reach the area unmolested and settle accounts with the American surface forces there in a night battle. American scout planes were in the air as well, both SBDs from the carriers and PBY Catalinas. It was one of the latter, again flying out of Nadeni, that found the Japanese, sighting the diversionary group at 0935 hours. However, Fletcher did not order an immediate attack on these ships. Other American scout planes had run into Japanese scouting planes. Some had seen submarines, and others the cruisers of Kondo's and Mikawa's squadrons. This led to a suspicion that not only were other enemy carriers present, but that the Japanese had probably located the American carriers themselves. This was not true, but it became so before long. At 1100 hours, a float plane from the Chitose found the American carriers. The American admiral waited for more reports to arrive from his scouts, and for the situation to become more clear. As a result, the Ryujo was able to launch her strike group, consisting of 6 B-5Ns and 15 A-6Ms, unmolested. These planes hit Henderson Field at 1423 hours, losing a few of their number in combat with the Marine fighters there, which also took a few losses. Little damage was done to the airfield in the raid. Almost simultaneously, at 1425 hours, a scout plane from the heavy cruiser Chikuma also found the Americans. This scout was shot down by American fighters, but not before getting off a sighting report. Tactical responsibilities were divided between the two American carriers' dive bomber squadrons. Saratoga's planes were held in readiness to launch a full-strength attack, while most of the Enterprise's Dauntlesses conducted scouting flights. 13 scout-configured SBD-3s, carrying 500-pound bombs, took off from the Big E's deck beginning at 1320 hours, 6 from Squadron VB6 and 7 from VS5. These planes then spread out to cover their assigned 10-degree search sectors towards the northwest quadrant, out to a range of 250 miles, about 400 kilometers. More sighting reports came in subsequently from the American planes, and Fletcher's picture became clear enough for him to decide to act. 1430, a little more than an hour after the Enterprise scouts took off, a strike wave of 38 planes was launched from the Saratoga to attack the diversionary group in the Ryujo. Enterprise scout planes made contact with several elements of the Japanese fleet before the Saratoga's planes found their target. A scouting pair from Bombing 6, searching a sector between 350 degrees and due north, found Kondo's main body force. These planes, flown by Lieutenant J.T. Lowe and his wingman R.D. Gibson, reported 3 cruisers, between 3 and 5 destroyers, and a pair of unidentified vessels making 20 knots heading due south. Scout bombers spotted these Japanese ships while cruising at a relatively low height, made their contact report, and spiraled upwards to attack altitude. They chose the largest of the heavy cruisers, which turned out to be the Maya, and went into their dives at 1510 hours. As they came down, the Maya kept her beam onto the attacking planes and skidded through an abrupt turn to starboard, almost completely reversing her course as they dove. Both Dauntlesses were met by heavy and light anti-aircraft fire, which was mostly short. The pair made their attacks unharmed and released their bombs from 2,500 feet, about 760 meters. Lowe's bomb went into the sea just off the ship's starboard quarter, while Gibson's impacted close alongside her port bow. Both near misses threw up huge geysers of seawater which enveloped the cruiser in spray but left her unharmed. The 2 planes pulled out of their dives and glided down to just over the water's surface, flying evasive courses with Japanese flak following them, escaping the area to the south. Both planes were unscathed, but unfortunately Gibson's plane ran out of fuel on the flight back to the carrier. Luckily for him and his backseater, they were able to find the American destroyer Farragut, part of Task Force 44, and ditch alongside. Another pair, made up of the planes of Lieutenant Ray Davis and his wingman Ensign R.C. Shaw, was assigned the sector between 340 and 350 degrees. At 1510 hours, they reported a force of 2 large carriers sailing in company with 10 cruisers and 8 destroyers, heading southeast at a speed of 28 knots. This was the big carrier force the Americans suspected was in the area and were looking for. The Dauntlesses were looking at the lead ships of Nagumo's striking group's surface escort. They spotted the enemy while flying at 1,500 feet, or about 460 meters, and immediately began to climb in a spiraling path to attack altitude and position. Initially, they chose as their target a destroyer, the first ship they had sighted, which they misidentified as a light cruiser. As they climbed, they sighted the rest of the force, including the unmistakable yellow wooden flight deck of a big carrier. This was the Shokaku, one of the most valuable targets in the Japanese Navy. Without hesitation, they made her their target instead. By good luck, they remained undetected as they made the 15-minute climb up to attack height. Lieutenant Davis transmitted repeated contact reports back to the fleet as they went up. Unfortunately, these reports got lost in the process of communication and never made it to Fletcher. Finally, at 15:45, the two SBDs tipped their noses down and made their attack dives. The surprise was almost complete, and the carrier only began to react as the SBDs came down, making their runs from 14,000 feet, about 4,300 meters, from a downwind, up-sun position. Lieutenant Davis went in first, with Ensign Shaw close behind. They were met by heavy flak from the startled Japanese warships, both heavy and light caliber weapons struggling to bear on the bombers. The big flat top threw herself into the tight, flank speed turn to starboard normally employed by the Japanese ships as an evasive measure. Both pilots released their 500-pounders from about 2,000 feet, or 600 meters, then pulled out at a very low altitude and made high-speed escape runs over the water's surface in the direction of the easternmost destroyer. Both reported close near misses on the wildly careening carrier. The heavier flak was reported as very inaccurate, while the lighter caliber automatic weapons fire was much closer. About a dozen aircraft were seen ranged on the flight deck of the enemy ship. The SBD crews also reported 8 enemy planes over the fleet, one of which was in position to make an attack run on the retreating Americans. This fighter, an A-67 Type 0, was reported by one of the Dauntlesses' rear gunners to be shot down by the Japanese' own anti-aircraft fire. In fact, 5 Japanese fighters, which had been launched as part of an airstrike, took off after the Americans but were unable to close, and the effort also made them unable to accompany the rest of their strike group. Both Dauntlesses escaped unscathed, but their target was likewise unharmed, and both bombs were near misses. Shrapnel thrown up by one of the blasts took the lives of 6 of the carrier's crewmen. Meanwhile, Saratoga's attack group was on the way to the reported position of Hara's diversionary group and the Ryujo. While they were on the way, the carrier was found by other American scouts, including a pair of Avengers which made a bombing run on the Ryujo from high altitude. This attack failed, with all bombs falling well astern of the ship. The Japanese reported this attack as being carried out by B-17s. A pair of Dauntlesses also found the Japanese here at 1500 hours, made a radio report of the sighting. Receiving no acknowledgement, however, this pair sped off back to the fleet in order to make the report in person. 10 minutes later, another pair of Dauntlesses arrived, along with another Avenger, and made another unacknowledged contact report. They maneuvered to attack, but were driven off by the Japanese combat air patrol. They eventually made it back to the Enterprise, but were unable to land due to fuel exhaustion and were forced to ditch, with their crews being picked up by the escorts. The Saratoga strike force was led by Commander Harry D. Felt. It's made up of 30 SBDs, 13 from Bombing 3 and 17 from Scouting 3, and 8 TBF Avengers from Torpedo Squadron 8, one of which aborted and returned to the carrier right after takeoff. The Dauntlesses were equipped for an anti-shipping strike mission and carried heavy 1,000-pound, 453-kilogram bombs. These planes heard the contact reports of the scouts just mentioned and adjusted heading in accord with their location reports. At 16:06, they spotted the Ryujo, and a few minutes later were maneuvering on a wide circle around her. Felt split his forces between the carrier and the largest of her escorts, the heavy cruiser Tone. The Ryujo would be targeted by 21 of the dive bombers and 5 of the torpedo planes, while the remaining planes went after the cruiser. 7 Japanese fighters were in the air, but these were unable to intervene. The attack on the carrier was conducted from many different directions by 4 groups of planes. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Kern, of VB-3, led the main force of 15 SBDs to a position where they could come at the carrier from the northwest, while 2 sections of 3 dive bombers apiece climbed further to 16,000 feet, 4,900 meters, and set themselves up to come from the opposite quarter. Meanwhile, the 5 Avengers glided down to sea level to begin their torpedo runs and split the defense. The dive bombers began their runs at 16:20 hours. As they did so, the Ryujo returned into the wind in a desperate attempt to get some more of her fighters in the air to ward off the avalanche of firepower bearing down on her. With considerable luck, the carrier managed to avoid all 21 bombs, suffering only a few near misses. Meanwhile, the 7 SBDs detailed to attack the Tone were gliding down in their approach dives, but had not yet begun their attack runs. Felt, observing the disappointing results of the strikes against the Ryujo, ordered them to break off their attack and go after the lucky flat top instead. 7 planes, led by Lieutenant Harold S. Bottomley of VB-3, accordingly climbed back up to 15,000 feet or 4,600 meters and deployed to make a textbook attack from various points along a circle, converging on the enemy ship. All 7 of the crews were veterans of the Midway battle, and the results of their attack reflected their experience. All 7 scored, making 3 direct hits with their 1,000-pound bombs and 4 close near misses. One of the Avengers was also successful, and a torpedo was observed to strike the carrier on the starboard side. The Americans left the Ryujo on fire from amidships aft, with flames seen to be shooting out of the openings onto the hangar deck. They ran into a fully alerted Japanese fighter defense on their way out. The aircraft of Ensign W.A. Bear, for one, was bounced and pursued by 5 Zero fighters, which shot up his Dauntless but were unable to bring him down. In fact, all of the Americans ran the gauntlet of the Japanese fighters in flak and returned to their carrier. One of the dive bombers claimed the destruction of a Nakajima torpedo bomber it encountered over the carrier, probably one of the strike groups sent to hit Henderson Field, which returned from their mission as the American attack was ending. The American strike doomed the Ryujo. As many as 120 of her men had died, and the ship was crippled and unable to maneuver. Not long after the Navy planes had left, B-17s from Espiritu Santo arrived above, made their own attack, though, as usually happened when these high-altitude bombers attack ships at sea, they achieved no hits. As night fell, the ship was abandoned by her crew and sank not long after. Her entire air group was also lost, the air crews ditching their planes in the sea near the sinking ship and being rescued by the accompanying destroyers Amatsukaze and Tokitsukaze. These and the undamaged Tone, with the survivors aboard, left the area after the rescue operations had been completed, set course to rendezvous with Nagumo's striking group. While this attack was taking place, the Japanese were not idle. As we noted before, the striking group had been located and attacked by Lieutenant Davis and Ensign Shaw at 15:45 hours. These men had reported bombers ranged on deck and fighters and bombers in the air. The scouts had in fact arrived during the launching of the Japanese second strike wave. The first wave was already away, and had been headed for the Americans for some time, since about 14:30 hours, shortly after the Enterprise in Saratoga had been pinpointed by the ill-fated scout plane from the Chikuma. The first wave consisted of 27 Val dive bombers escorted by 15 Zero fighters under the command of the veteran Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki. These sped southwards towards the American task groups, the radar of which picked them up on the way in at 16:02 hours. A total of 54 Wildcat fighters were vectored out to intercept, but command and control difficulties along with the efforts of the escort fighters kept the dive bombers safe. The U.S. carriers had a force of strike planes on deck in readiness to hit the Japanese carriers once their location was pinpointed. These were immediately launched as the Japanese planes bored in order to either head north and attack targets of opportunity, or to get clear of the battle zone and circle back once the attack was over. The Wildcats, though unable to stop the dive bombers, pressed the pursuit vigorously, even to the point of following them down into their attack dives. This proved more dangerous to them than it did to the Vals, and at least 4 were shot down by their own ship's flak. Most of the Vals concentrated on the Enterprise and landed 3 direct hits on her flight deck. One of these penetrated deep into the ship before exploding below the waterline, blowing a hole in her side and causing the carrier to take on water and begin to list. The second hit near the aft elevator and detonated a portion of the ship's 5-inch anti-aircraft ammunition, setting off a large secondary explosion. The third bomb detonated on impact with the flight deck, blowing a large hole in it, but causing little other damage. The Enterprise was badly damaged. It was on fire. More than 70 of her men had been killed and about the same number badly wounded. 7 of the Vals went after the battleship North Carolina instead. These achieved no hits. Saratoga was not attacked. The strike group that she had launched returned from the attack on the Ryujo to find this attack on the Enterprise in full swing. Obviously, they were unable to land on their wildly maneuvering carriers, and as a result, the returning aircraft threw themselves into the defense. This was another example of the Dauntless being used in an air-to-air capacity, recalling their employment as the so-called inner air patrols of the Coral Sea battle. 3 of the Saratoga's SBDs, those flown by Lieutenants R.K. Campbell, H.R. Burnett, and William E. Henry, each claimed the destruction of a Val dive bomber, bringing the total number of air-to-air victories claimed by this strike group on this mission to 4. These claims, like so many others in the Pacific War, are debatable, but what is certain is that the Japanese strike group was badly mauled by the American defense in this engagement, with no fewer than 25 of the planes involved reported as lost. The survivors disengaged from the American task force, formed back up outside the battle area, and set off homewards in small groups. However, they had done their job. The Enterprise, though still afloat, was out of the fight. She was patched up well enough to recover her scouting aircraft soon after the engagement, but she was unable to remain in the Solomons area, and was sent back to Pearl Harbor for extensive repairs, where she remained until the middle of October. The Japanese, for their part, overestimated the extent of their success, and Nagumo seems to have believed that both of the American carriers had been put out of action in this attack. The second wave was launched from the decks of the Shikoku and the Zukaku. This was interrupted by Davis and Shaw's attack on the Shikoku, and was continued after their departure. The second strike group was made up of 27 more dive bombers escorted by 14 Zeros, 5 of which were unable to proceed with the rest as a result of their pursuit of the retreating Dauntlesses. This second wave was unable to locate their target, and returned to the carriers with the loss of 5 of their own number to accidents. Nagumo, his air group having taken heavy losses and his ships low on fuel, turned his ships around that evening and retreated to the north, bringing the carrier duel to an end. The Japanese surface forces would continue on southward through the night, hoping to be able to bring about a night battle with the American task force. These two broke off at midnight and headed back north in the direction of Rabaul. Most of the Japanese ships would remain in the northern reaches of the Solomons Chain, out of range of the planes on Henderson Field, until the 5th of September, when they were finally withdrawn to the fleet base at Truk. However, one more air attack was made in this battle, by the planes launched from the American carriers as the Japanese strike force bore in on them. 2 SBDs and 7 Avengers made it off of Saratoga, while the Enterprise launched 11 SBDs and another 7 Avengers. The planes from the Saratoga were ordered to hit the heavy ships of Abe's Vanguard Force, and left to do this at 1700 hours. The Enterprise planes formed up as they circled their embattled ship. Shortly after the Saratoga's planes set off, were ordered to proceed towards the Ryujo, which was already sinking, though this was not known at the time. These planes, designated Flight 300, set off on the stricken flat top's last reported bearing. The Enterprise planes searched along this path for 2 hours and found nothing. The chances of contact with the enemy were not improved by the coming of darkness. The Avengers jettisoned their torpedoes and headed back to the carriers as their fuel ran low. But the 11 Dauntlesses, led by Lieutenant Turner Caldwell, having reached the expected point of contact, pressed on for another 50 miles or 80 kilometers in search of their target. This put them beyond the point of no return, with too little gas to return to their ship, which had meanwhile been heavily damaged anyway by the Japanese dive bombers. Instead, they jettisoned their 1,000-pound bombs and trimmed their fuel mixture to the most economic possible setting, and adjusted course for Henderson Field. They flew to Guadalcanal by the light of a bright full moon, and all 11 landed there safely. The men in planes of Flight 300, without a carrier to fly from once the Enterprise was withdrawn, would subsequently operate from the airfield alongside the Marine planes already stationed there. The Saratoga's planes likewise were unable to find their assigned targets, the battleships and heavy cruisers of the Vanguard Force. They did, however, find the support units of Kondo's main body. At 1740, the planes made contact with the destroyer screen, the light cruiser Yura, and the heavy cruisers, along with the seaplane carrier Chitose. The Dauntless crews misidentified the seaplane carrier somehow as the massive super-dreadnought battleship Musashi. Living up to their name, they were nevertheless undaunted by the prospect of attacking such a powerful ship, and chose her as their target. The dive bombers flew through a heavy flak barrage as they dove on the 11,000-ton seaplane carrier, but were unhit, released their weapons from 2,000 feet or 600 meters. Both bombs were close near misses, but close enough to rupture the ship's thin sides and flood her engineering compartments, causing her to take on a 30-degree list. She was also sprayed with shrapnel from the impacts, which shredded the seaplane she had aboard and started a serious fire. As the American planes withdrew, the burning and listing Chitose looked doomed, but efficient damage control action on the part of her crew brought the fires and the flooding under control. She was able to turn back and withdraw under her own power, heading for the fleet base at Truk at a speed of 16 knots. This was the end of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, or as it was called at the time, the Battle of the Stewart Islands. The Japanese came off much the worse in this engagement, losing the carrier Ryujo and a significant part of the air groups of the Shokaku and Zuikaku. The air crew's loss further eroded the core of experienced, battle-hardened naval aviators available to the Japanese. The Americans lost many fewer aircraft in this battle, including only a pair of SBDs, but they did not come off unscathed. The serious damage done to the Enterprise left them with only the Saratoga in the area on the immediate aftermath of the action. Also worrying was the relative lack of accuracy of the SBDs in this action, which scored only 4 hits on enemy vessels out of 36 bombs dropped. Had the Japanese continued to advance, only the Saratoga's planes and the SBDs of Flight 300, along with their Marine counterparts on Henderson Field, would have been present to oppose them. How effective they may have been is illustrated by the attack the combined Navy and Marine Dauntlesses made the next day on Tanaka's close escort force, which was withdrawing along with the troop transports after having shelled the field during the early morning hours. In this strike, which was detailed in a previous episode of this series, the dive bombers hit Tanaka's flagship, the cruiser Jinsu, and the troopship Kinyu Maru, seriously damaging both of them. The troopship was beyond saving, and the destroyer Mutsuki was sent alongside to take off her crew and the troops that were left aboard. Just as she pulled up, B-17s from Espiritu Santo arrived overhead and dropped their loads on the pair. In one of the rare instances of a successful high-altitude heavy bomber strike on naval ships at sea to occur in the Pacific War, the fortresses landed 5 heavy bombs close aboard the Mitsuki, which went down almost immediately. As we have seen in our episodes concerning combat in the Southwest Pacific so far, a vital role was played by long-range flying boats operating from the lagoons and islands dotting the region. Before we go on to the second carrier battle we'll be examining in this episode, I'd like to take a closer look at one of the flying boats that the opponents were using here. The well-known consolidated PBY Catalina was ubiquitous during the Pacific War, serving in search and rescue and anti-submarine roles as well as the more typical maritime reconnaissance mission. Catalinas flew in all theaters of the war and in the service of most of the Allied powers. Most students of the Pacific War are already familiar with this aircraft, however, so let's look instead at what the Japanese were flying. The Japanese counterpart to the PBY was the Kawanishi H6k, known in the Allied reporting name scheme as the Mavis. This was a larger machine than the Catalina, with 4 engines mounted on a long, high aspect ratio parasol wing. The aircraft had a longer, slimmer hull shape than the Catalina and a twin-fin tail assembly. The design originated in a 1933 requirement issued by the Navy for a 4-engine monoplane flying boat, with a performance superior to that of the civilian Sikorsky S-42 model then used by Pan American Airways on their long trans-Pacific routes. This meant a cruising speed higher than 120 knots, or 225 kph, and a range of better than 2,500 nautical miles, or 4,600 kilometers. In response to this specification, the Kawanishi design team headed by Yoshio Hashiguchi and Shizuo Kikuhara produced the Type S, a gracefully shaped aircraft powered by Nakajima Hikari 2 9-cylinder 840 horsepower air-cooled radial engines. The prototype was fitted with attachments for an offensive load of 2 1,000 kilogram or 2,205 pound bombs, or 2 800 kilogram or 1,764 pound torpedoes mounted on the main wing struts. Production models could carry these payloads or substitute larger numbers of lighter bombs, usually 4 250 kilogram, 551 pound bombs, or 16 60 kilogram or 132 pound weapons. Defensive armament consisted of 3 Type 97 7.7 millimeter machine guns, 1 in an open bow position, 1 in the tail, and 1 in a dorsal turret. The turret was a power-driven model of French design, the first such device to be fitted to a Japanese aircraft. The prototype was first flown on July 14, 1936, found to be almost totally satisfactory as produced, with only one modification, a rearward revision of the placement of the first hydrodynamic step in the hull bottom, found to be desirable. The prototype was then turned over to the Navy for evaluation, which found the flying boat's performance adequate, though the machine was somewhat underpowered. Development was therefore continued through 1937 and into 1938, with 3 more prototypes being made, which received minor changes to the design such as increased aileron span and larger tail fins. They were also re-engined with more powerful Mitsubishi Kinsei 14-cylinder 1,000 horsepower radios. These adjustments increased the flying boat's performance to meet the Navy's standards, and the revised Type S was accepted for service as the H6K-1, sometimes called the Navy Type 97 flying boat, Model 1. The H6K was put into series production at the Kawanishi plant in Naruo, on the island of Honshu near the city of Osaka. By 1939, improved versions of the initial design were being produced. Passenger transport variants were produced for the use of Greater Nippon Airlines Limited, with increased fuel storage, cargo spaces in the bow and stern sections, a galley, and accommodations for as many as 18 passengers. 36 of these airliner variants were produced. For the Navy, the new H6K-4 was appearing. This model had a much greater fuel capacity, and a revised defensive armament of 4 Type 92 7.7mm machine guns in dorsal, waist, and bow positions, and a Type 99 20mm automatic cannon in the tail. The power-operated dorsal turret was also eliminated on this model. The next year, a further upgrade, the H6K5, was produced, using more powerful versions of the Mitsubishi engine, which were rated at 1,200 horsepower. The open gun position in the bow was eliminated on this model and replaced with a turret in the cabin roof behind the cockpit. These two later variants, the H6k4 and H6k5, also called the Navy Flying Boat Type 97 Model 2-2 and 2-3, were in service with the Navy at the outbreak of the Pacific War. These were big planes, 7,500 kilograms or 38,500 pounds fully loaded, a wingspan of 40 meters or 131 feet, had a crew of 9 men. The engines were fitted with superchargers and drove 3-bladed Hamilton Sumitomo constant-speed propellers. The flying boat could make a maximum speed of 206 knots, or 380 kph, and cruise at 140 knots, or 260 kph. At economical settings, and with a full fuel load of 2,960 gallons, or 13,400 liters, the Mavis could achieve a range of 3,550 nautical miles, or 6,600 kilometers. The aircraft structure was all metal, with fabric-covered control surfaces. Like many other contemporary Japanese naval aircraft, it lacked armored protection for the crew and self-sealing fuel storage. These omissions helped the flying boat to achieve its outstanding range, but made it very vulnerable to enemy fire. The Mavis normally carried Type 96 air-to-ground and Type 1 plane-to-plane radio communications equipment, as well as Type 0 direction finding and homing gear. Some later H6k5s were also fitted with search radar. There were 66 on hand on the day of Pearl Harbor. The Toko Kokutai, or Naval Air Corps, based on Formosa, or Taiwan, and the Yokohama Kokutai each operated 24. The Yokosuka Kokutai had 3, and the Sasebo Kokutai accounted for the remaining 15. These flew reconnaissance support for the Japanese forces as they overran the Philippines, but saw little air combat due to the absence of American air units in this battle. With the turn of 1942, however, this situation changed. On January 4th, 11 H6Ks mounted a bombing raid on the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Guadalcanal on New Britain, not far from Naval. 2 days later, 9 returned for another crack at the airfield, and were met by a patrol of 4 Australian Commonwealth Wirraways, advanced trainer aircraft that were also used as fighters. The flying boats propelled the interception of the Australian planes without loss to either side, what is considered to be the first air-to-air combat in the Southwest Pacific Theater. H6Ks would subsequently hit Australian and Dutch targets in the area in support of the advance on Rabaul, which fell on the 23rd. On February 5th, as the Japanese advance continued, formation of 9 of these flying boats bound the strategic town of Port Moresby on the island of New Guinea. By May, the Japanese were advancing into the Solomons area in an operation codenamed Mo. Naval air units assigned to the advance included the air groups of the Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with the Yokohama Kokutai units including 16 H6Ks. These were flown out of the newly captured bases of Rabaul and in the Shortland Islands, and after its capture on the 3rd, from Tulagi and the Solomons. They took their first loss to the Americans here on the 5th, when an H6K4 flying out of Rabaul was shot down by F-4F Wildcat fighters from the American carriers in the area. This was part of the prelude to the Coral Sea battle, and the American carriers involved were spotted at 0810 hours the next day, steaming 600 miles or 965 kilometers south of Tulagi by one of the H6K4s based there, though this crew sighting report only reached the Japanese commander, Chuichi Hara, the next day. The Tulagi-based Mavises were involved in little combat between that day and the beginning of Operation Watchtower, with the exception of a series of nuisance raids launched against targets on the Australian coast in June and July, in which small units of flying boats hit Townsville and Mossman on the Queensland coast. The H6K was also involved in air-to-air actions against Allied maritime patrol planes. A frequent antagonist from 1943 on was the consolidated PB-4Y Privateer, a navalized variant of the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. These duels between the big 4-engine planes over the vast Pacific waste were a different kind of aerial combat. To give a flavor of this kind of battle, I will quote a brief combat report filed by one of the privateer crews concerning their encounter with a Mavis. Quote, the PB-4Y was at 8,000 feet when the Mavis was sighted some 5 miles ahead at 6,000 feet. The Mavis evidently sighted the PB-4Y and dived towards the sea, later opened fire with the tail cannon and a waist gun. Full power was applied by the PB-4Y pilot, and upon reaching a position at 9 o'clock and 500 feet above the Mavis, first attack was made. Fire was opened at 900 feet above, closing to 200 feet above, and was maintained until out of range. The number 3 engine on the Mavis was set on fire on this run. On the second run, although fire was maintained, no apparent damage resulted. On the third run, at 9 o'clock high, the belly turret gunner shot off the tail of the Mavis. This was followed by an immediate explosion in the wing center section. The wingtips seemed to fall off as the Mavis fell flaming into the sea. The Mavis appeared helpless in the face of the superior fire of the PB-4Y, and at no time offered any effective resistance. The PB-4Y attained 270 miles per hour indicated airspeed to overtake the Mavis from about 3 miles in 3 minutes. This action report offers a good representative illustration of the experience of Japanese naval aviation itself once the weight of American technological and industrial power was brought to bear against it in earnest. By mid-October, it was becoming clear to the Japanese High Command that the counteroffensive mounted by the forces of the 18th Army under Lieutenant General Hirakuchi Hyakutake had been a failure, despite the support given its troops by heavy night bombardments from the battleships and cruisers of the fleet. As a result, Yamamoto decided once again to attempt to bring about a decisive victory at sea. On the 11th, ships began to leave the anchorage at Truk and head south towards Guadalcanal again. Japanese deployment was once again elaborate, composed of several separate groups of ships. These were organized into 3 main forces, all of which had participated in the Eastern Solomons battle. Leading the way this time was Abe's Vanguard Force, living up to its name this time. Yamamoto hoped that the Americans would be tempted to expend their carrier planes' attacks on the heavily armored warships of this squadron, which were also bristling with flak. The Vanguard Force was once again built around the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. These were supported by 3 heavy cruisers, the Tone, Chikuma, and Otago, screened by a squadron of 8 destroyers led by the light cruiser Nagara. Steaming about 60 miles or 100 kilometers behind them was the main carrier squadron, Nagumo's striking force. This consisted of 3 carriers, the veteran Shokaku and Zuikaku, which were joined this time by the 11,500-ton Suiho. The carriers were also provided with a heavier close surface escort than they had enjoyed in the August battle. This was made up of 1 heavy cruiser, the Kamano, along with 8 destroyers. A short distance to the west was Kondo's main body cruiser force, called the Advance Force according to this plan. It was made up of 2 elements, a surface combat force of 4 heavy cruisers, the Otago, Takayo, Myoko, and Maya, and a squadron of 6 destroyers led by the light cruiser Isuzu. The cruiser force was supported by a carrier squadron with the light carrier Junyo and another pair of destroyers. This supporting carrier group had been twice as strong as this when they had set out from Truk, but the light carrier Hiyo, which had sailed with them, had developed serious mechanical trouble before reaching the vicinity of the Solomons, and had turned back for repairs with another pair of destroyers. These 3 groups of ships were intended to prosecute a decisive battle against the U.S. fleet in the waters to the northeast of the island. Fighting in this action would thus take place very near the scene of the August battle. They were not the only Japanese forces in the area. Vice Admiral Kurita was operating in the Solomons on a supporting mission. His force had carried out a devastating bombardment of Henderson Field, destroying most of the aircraft based there on the night of the 13th-14th of October. Kurita's force included another pair of battleships, the Haruna and the Congo, with an escort of 6 destroyers. In total, then, the Japanese were coming with 4 battleships, 2 light and 2 fleet carriers, 10 cruisers, and 30 destroyers. In addition, 12 Japanese submarines were deployed in the battle zone, positioned along patrol lines designed to catch the approaching Americans as they closed for battle. For their part, the Americans were about as strong as they had been in the Eastern Solomons battle. Once again, their carrier strength was divided into 2 task forces, each built around a single fleet carrier. Task Force 16 was centered on the Enterprise, which had recently returned to the area after being repaired at Pearl Harbor of the damage she had taken from Nagumo's dive bombers on the 24th of August. Task Force 16 was still commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, and included the battleship South Dakota, the heavy cruiser Portland, and the light cruiser San Juan, 8 destroyers divided into 2 squadrons. After the Enterprise expedited repairs were completed and a new air group arrived to replace the plane she had left behind on Henderson, this group had departed Pearl on the 16th, and arrived in the New Hebrides on the 23rd, when they met up with Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral George D. Murray. This force was built around the Hornet, with an escort of 2 heavy cruisers, the Northampton and the Pensacola, 2 light cruisers, the San Diego and the Juno, as well as 6 destroyers. Hornet and her task force had been dispatched to the Solomons area in the months since the Eastern Solomons battle. Both the Saratoga and the Wasp had been badly damaged by torpedoes from Japanese submarines on the 31st of August and the 14th of September, respectively. Saratoga was withdrawn for repairs, which would last for 3 months. The Wasp was sunk. This left the Hornet as the only American carrier in the area until the hastily repaired Enterprise arrived. Carrier groups were supplemented by a strong surface force, Task Force 64, under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, made up of the battleship Washington, a heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 6 more destroyers. Total U.S. Navy strength on the eve of the battle then consisted of 2 battleships, 2 fleet carriers, 9 cruisers, and 20 destroyers. The Japanese then were once again stronger in terms of ships. In the air, though, they were also stronger this time, bringing a total of 212 carrier planes against the Americans' 159. The American carriers carried a higher proportion of fighters than they had in the Eastern Solomons battle. Some of their Dauntlesses were the new Dash 4 model, which was beginning to make its way to the front line in October. These newer planes were almost identical to the previous Dash 3 model, differing mainly in having a 24-volt electrical system instead of the older 12-volt system. These were a minority, and most of the dive bombers in the American air groups remained the SBD-3 model. Contact was made with the oncoming Japanese on the afternoon of the 23rd, still far out of range, when a Catalina flying boat found the heavy ships of the Vanguard Force. No further action resulted from this distant contact, however. Yamamoto, commanding the fleet from his flagship Yamato in the anchorage at Truk, directed Nagumo to reverse course with his carrier squadron 2 days later on the 25th, while Abe's surface force continued on course to the southeast. This put more distance between the 2 groups of ships, and made less likely the sighting of the carriers or their involvement in a strike launched against Abe's ships by the Americans. In fact, same day another American scout plane found Nagumo's carriers. Attacks by land-based planes on the Japanese yielded no results, while for their part the Japanese mounted an air raid on American positions on Guadalcanal with the Junyo's air group. However, at this point neither side's shipborne aircraft had spotted the enemy's ships. This is not for lack of trying. On the afternoon of the 25th, the Enterprise, as she had in the opening phase of the Eastern Solomons battle, launched a scouting group of 12 SBDs to scout out the quadrant from north to west out to a distance of 200 miles or 320 kilometers. These were followed by a further dozen sent out an hour later as part of a strike group sent out to hit whatever Japanese vessels the scouts may find. These planes found nothing, and flew out to the limits of their endurance before turning back for their ships. Night fell as the Aviators made their return journey, and they were compelled to attempt night landings on their carrier decks. Many of the crews were green replacements who had never tried to land on a carrier in the dark. 7 of the American planes, 3 of which were SBDs, were unable to do so and ditched in the sea near the ships. The planes, of course, were lost, but all the crewmen were pulled from the sea safely by the escort vessels. No further action by carrier planes took place this day. The Japanese carriers had turned back southwards at about 0300 hours, and a radar-equipped Catalina had found them at 0310. During the remainder of the pre-dawn hours, the Americans and Japanese headed towards one another, and by 0500 hours, the distance between them had shrunk to 200 nautical miles, or 370 kilometers. The sighting report did not reach Kincaid until more than 2 hours later, however, and by that time the American commander decided that the chances of the Japanese having changed course in the meantime were too high. More scouts were sent out to take up the search. A wave of 16 SBDs had been launched at 0610 hours, all carrying 500-pound bombs, and directed to search an arc between 235 and 365 degrees, out to a distance of 200 miles, 320 kilometers. Shortly afterwards, a further 6 Dauntlesses were put in the air, armed with depth bombs to fly anti-submarine patrols around the American task forces. 1 pair of the American scout planes found Abe's force. The 2-plane section from VS-10 was composed of the aircraft of Lieutenant J.G. K.B. Miller and Lieutenant J.G. Howard Burnett. They found the unmistakable pagoda masts of the Vanguard Force battleships while cruising at 1,200 feet, 360 meters, then climbed to attack altitude. On the way up, one of their backseaters, Radioman 3rd Class David Cawley, composed and sent a sighting report of 2 Congo-class battleships escorted by 4 cruisers and 6 to 8 destroyers. The report was sent twice. No acknowledgement was received. Crews didn't expect one, as the Enterprise and her task force were maintaining radio silence. The skies were full of built-up cumulus formations, and the SBDs were unobserved for most of their approach and climb to altitude. The Japanese formation continued steaming in formation without changing course or speed. As the 2 planes approached a position directly above the ships, one of the heavy cruisers began signaling them with a searchlight, apparently looking for a recognition signal. Instead, they saw the Dauntlesses open their dive flaps and begin to dive towards them. The ship, which was the Tone, opened up with all their anti-aircraft guns, and the rest of the Japanese fleet followed suit. The bombers armed their 500-pounders and went into the attack. This is from Cawley's account of the action. Quote, "I was standing up in the back cockpit, hanging onto my guns with one hand and leaning out, looking over the wing at the ships. I wondered where all those shells and anti-aircraft projectiles were. Then the sky just exploded with every color: gray, black, silver, blue, and long trails of smoky phosphorus. One went off under our right wing and we were blown over onto our back. Terrible loud wham, like being in a tin can someone hit with a shotgun. We dove away and closed our flaps and dropped a bomb. I don't know where it went. The AA continued as we dove at very high speed, clear down to 50 or 100 feet over the water, heading east. The battleships began shooting their main batteries at us. The big shells would hit the water very near and send up big geysers. We would take evasive action and they still came close. This went on until we were over the horizon a full 15 miles away, and only the tops of their pagodas were visible. Miller and Cawley made their way back to Point Option, a prearranged rendezvous with their carrier, and found nothing. Following standard procedure in this circumstance, they tuned to the carrier's radio beacon and homed in on its signal, only to find their task force miles away, under attack by Japanese dive bombers. They approached the Hornet, the only carrier visible, but were fired on and turned away. They circled out away from the embattled flat top, which was soon taking hits. Eventually the pair found the Enterprise 10 miles or 16 kilometers to the south, emerging from the cover of a rain squall. She was undamaged and not under attack, and they could land their plane, which was getting low on gas, down on her. Relieved, they flew to her and put down on her deck after nearly 5 hours in the air. Their safety was by no means guaranteed, however, as the next wave of Japanese planes had found this carrier as they landed. Almost immediately after their SBD was taken below to the hangar deck, Cawley was thrown to the deck by a Japanese bomb, smashing into the carrier just aft of the elevator on which they had just ridden down. Both crewmen were otherwise unharmed. The experienced Dodger Tone, target of their dive, was likewise unscathed in the action. At 0645, not long after their encounter with Abe's ships, other SBDs found Nagumo's carriers. 5 minutes later, another pair of SBDs also found the Japanese flat tops. American planes were engaged by fighters of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol and eventually chased away and forced to seek cover in a thick cloud bank, but not before transmitting contact reports. The first reports did not mention carriers, but the last three that the scouts were able to transmit mentioned 2 carriers and an escorting vessel. Within a few minutes of the American scout plane's arrival near Nagumo's ships, a Japanese float plane from the cruiser Tone found the Hornet and her task force. Therefore, the 2 rival fleets began to prepare to strike one another at almost exactly the same time. The Japanese got their planes into the air first, in their first wave, made up of 21 D-3A dive bombers and 20 B-5N torpedo planes escorted by 21 A-6M fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, was headed for the American fleet by 0740. As they were clearing the area, though, the Americans made their first attack. Attracted by the first 2 pairs of SBD sighting reports, 2 more dive bombers, flown by Lieutenant Bernie Strong and Ensign Charles Irvine, left their own assigned scouting area and closed in on the carrier's reported location, finding them at 0720. Coming from an up-sun position, they were able to climb to 14,000 feet or about 4,300 meters and approach undetected. Both were able to make their dives unopposed, not even meeting anti-aircraft fire on the way down, and release their 500-pounders from just 1,500 feet or about 450 meters. Both planes dove on the Zuiho, and both of their bombs smashed into her flight deck on her after section. First blew up among her anti-aircraft gun positions, putting them out of action. The other punched through the hangar deck and exploded there, causing a fire and blowing a large hole in her flight deck. This rendered her unable to recover aircraft, but aside from this, little critical damage was done. In fact, she would remain with the rest of Nagumo's squadron in order to launch the rest of her attack group, which remained intact on deck, and then retired a truck under her own power for repairs. Her aircraft would remain in the fight, landing on the decks of the other Japanese carriers. Another pair of scouting planes also found the Japanese, specifically the heavy cruiser Tone, and carried out attacks on her, but both bombs missed and the ship suffered no damage. These attacks did little to deter the Japanese. Another wave of attack planes were launched from Nagumo's ships, and then a third of 29 more from the Junyo, which, along with the rest of the Kondo's main body force, was also moving to engage. By 0910 hours, there were 110 Japanese planes on the way to strike the American carriers. In addition, the heavy ships of the Vanguard Force were sent ahead at full speed in the hopes of catching the Americans in a surface action, while Kondo's ships also raced ahead. Meanwhile, the American carriers were launching their own attack forces. Time was of the essence, and their aircraft were dispatched in 3 small waves rather than spending time to assemble a mass striking formation. The planes were away by 0800, 20 minutes after the first Japanese strike group had set off. This group, from the Hornet, consisted of 15 SBDs and 6 Avengers escorted by 8 Wildcats. 10 minutes later, a second group, with 3 SBDs, 9 Avengers, and 8 Wildcats from the Enterprise was on its way to the Japanese. A third wave, from the Hornet, was away at 0820. This consisted of 9 SBDs, 10 Avengers, and 7 Wildcats. The aircraft of the opposing fleets passed one another en route, and the Enterprise group was attacked by 9 Zero fighters from the Zuiho. They shot down 3 Wildcats and 2 Avengers in this engagement for the loss of 4 of their own, and damaged another fighter and 2 torpedo bombers badly enough for them to abort and return to the Enterprise. The remaining 5 Zeros, however, were also forced to abort, having exhausted their ammunition in the battle. The Japanese first strike found the Hornet at 0852 hours. She had been warned of the approaching bombers by her own outgoing aircraft, and the ships had detected them with their radar at 35 nautical miles or 65 kilometers range, almost exactly as the Japanese sighted the ships in the distance. 37 Wildcats were sent to intercept, but, as had happened at Eastern Solomons, problems in communication and control procedure meant that most of these failed to make contact with the Japanese. Most of the incoming planes managed to avoid the defending fighters entirely. The Vals went into their dives at 0910, and in a well-coordinated attack with the torpedo planes, they managed to score 3 direct hits on the carrier, while the Kates added a pair of torpedo strikes. 2 more Japanese dive bombers, damaged by the heavy flak barrage, crashed into the carrier, one into her funnel and the other into her side, causing further damage and spilling burning gasoline all over the carrier's superstructure. Fires raged out of control, her engines were stopped, and with 111 of her crew dead and many more wounded, Hornet was put out of action. Eventually, damage control personnel brought the fires under control, but they were unable to restore power, and the carrier was taken in tow by the heavy cruiser Northampton. The attack had been costly for the Japanese, however, about 25 of their planes destroyed. The Hornet was targeted partly because the Enterprise was hidden in a rain squall when the first wave arrived. The second Japanese strike came an hour later, and found her in the clear. Another combined torpedo dive-bombing attack landed 2 bombs aboard her and a number of close near misses, killing 44 of her crew and causing considerable damage, including jamming her deck elevators, but not enough to stop her from operating her aircraft. The Japanese paid heavily for this success as well, however, and 10 of the 19 dive bombers that attacked the Enterprise were destroyed. The destroyer Smith was also damaged in this attack, when a damaged B-5N torpedo plane crashed into her, setting the ship on fire and killing 57 of her crew. The torpedo of this plane carried lodged in the ship and exploded soon afterwards, causing further destruction and fires. His stricken ship burning out of control, Smith's commander steered her into the wake close behind the racing battleship South Dakota. The tremendous spray thrown up by the massive vessel traveling at high speed doused the conflagration aboard the destroyer, and incredibly, the Smith was able to resume her station and continue to blast away at the remaining Japanese planes with her anti-aircraft battery. The Americans had also found the Japanese carriers. The first attack wave, with 15 Dauntlesses from the Hornet Squadrons VB-8 and VS-8, found the burning Zuiho and the undamaged Shokaku not long after their own carrier had come under attack at 019 hours. Formation, all carrying 1,000-pounders, pushed 12,000 feet or 3,600 meters, and as they came in, they were attacked by the fighters of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, which shot up 4 of them, including the formation leader, Lieutenant Commander Gus Wilhelm. Like so many other American naval aviators, he and his backseater, George Stokely, managed a water landing and survived in an inflatable raft for a few days on the open sea before being picked up by an American flying boat. Another of the damaged Dauntlesses, with a badly wounded pilot, managed to limp back to the Enterprise, but the other 2 splashed into the sea with no survivors. The rest of the flight bore in on the Japanese undeterred. Lieutenant J.M. Vos, head of the VS-8 planes, led the attack after Wilhelm's loss. This is from his account of the attack. Quote, "I was the first to dive. Wilhelm's people had joined on mine, and I saw 3 hits on Shokaku. As we pulled out, we were taking evasive action at wave top level under continued Zero attack. The Zeros finally retired and we came inside of the task force. The Hornet was badly hit and unable to take us aboard, and although Enterprise was on fire forward and with a bomb hit aft, we still recovered aboard. The aft elevator of the Enterprise was jammed in the down position, so it was necessary to catch the number 1 wire. I can recall that yawning hole in the deck as I landed and released my tailhook. When we landed, my flight officer, Fred Bates, gave me a piece of charred wood from the flight deck of the Shokaku. From my hit, it had blown into his cockpit on his way down. The 11 Dauntlesses had executed another textbook attack on the Shokaku, their frequent antagonist of the last few months. 4 or possibly 6 direct hits were achieved, 2 of the bombs impacting forward of the aft elevator and the rest behind it. The last SBD to attack lost track of the carrier in the chaos above the fleet and attacked the destroyer Terazuki instead, causing minor damage with a near miss. The carrier was devastated and set aflame, but amazingly the Japanese damage control was effective, and the ship survived to withdraw under her own power. Recovering her planes was out of the question, however, and the survivors of her air group landed on the remaining serviceable Japanese flat tops. 6 Avengers had also been part of this assault wave, but these were unable to locate the carrier after becoming separated from the dive bombers, and turned back to the Hornet after searching. On the way, they found the heavy cruiser Tone and launched their torpedoes against her, without success. A second wave of American planes was on the way before this attack was over. The Enterprise second wave included 3 SBDs from VB-10, but flown by crews from VS-10. 7 more came with the Hornet's second wave, all armed with 1,000-pounders. These groups failed to find the carriers, but instead encountered the target the Japanese had intended them to attack, the heavy ships of Abe's Vanguard Force. Enterprise's trio chose the battleship Kirishima as their target, claimed 2 direct hits, landing 1 starboard amidships and another square atop her B main battery turret, with the third bomb a near miss off her starboard bow. Japanese records state that only minor damage was done to the Kirishima in this raid, so these reports are likely in error. The 3 SBDs ran the gauntlet of the battle squadron's heavy flak batteries with no damage, successfully made their escape, forming back up away from the enemy ships and returning unharmed to their carrier, with the additional claim of 1-0 shot down on the return flight. Most of the Hornet's second wave dive bombers concentrated on the heavy cruiser Chikuma. The first 2 SBDs came down from opposite quarters. Both scored direct hits on the cruiser's bridge, 1,000-pounder smashing in from the port side, followed by another from the starboard, completely wrecking that portion of her superstructure and killing almost all of the bridge personnel. The hapless vessel then took 2 more direct hits, one of which punched through her armored deck and went off in one of her engine rooms. This crushing assault left the Chikuma with more than 190 dead and 154 wounded, burning, and almost totally without power. This tough ship refused to give up, and astoundingly, propulsion was restored. She was eventually able to make it back to truck under her own power. This strike was the last major action of what became known as the Battle of Santa Cruz, after the island group a short distance to the southeast of the main scene of action. Nagumo's force retired that afternoon, along with the Junyo, through Indispensable Strait. Abe and Kondo's surface forces kept up the pursuit of the retiring Americans until 1800 hours, when they too turned back north, once again unable to force the decisive battle line confrontation that they had sought. A prominent feature of this engagement is the very effective performance of Japanese damage control, which managed to save the devastated Shikaku and Chikuma after these ships took a tremendous punishment from the Dauntlesses. The results would appear to be a loss for the Americans, for while the Japanese did not lose any ships at all in this battle, the U.S. Navy lost the destroyer Porter as well as the Hornet. She had been taken under tow by the Northampton. The cruiser was only able to pull the stricken ship at 5 knots. While they were attempting to retire in 15-20 hours, they were found by 7 torpedo bombers of the wave launched by the Junyo. One of these hit the nearly motionless carrier, and this hit finally doomed her. A further bomb hit was scored on her hulk by a plane from the last Japanese strike of the day, dropped from a B-5N torpedo bomber in a level bombing attack. Her crew were taken off and she was abandoned. The carrier refused to die easily. After the wreck was abandoned, a pair of destroyers, the USS Mustin and the USS Anderson, were detailed to put her on the bottom. They tried their best, but even after expending 9 torpedoes and 430 rounds of 5-inch ammunition on her, they had to leave her on the surface. 4 long-lance torpedoes from the Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo eventually sent her to the bottom. In terms of aircraft losses, the battle was costly to both sides. The Japanese lost almost 100 planes, 26 of which fell to the guns of the battleship South Dakota alone. SBDs fighting in an air-to-air capacity made 7 victory claims. The Americans lost fewer aircraft, though still enough to hurt, total amounting to 74 of all types. In addition, the Enterprise and South Dakota took damage, as well as the cruisers Portland and San Juan, along with the destroyers Smith and Hughes. And that is where I think I will conclude this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. 2 battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz are lesser known than those of Coral Sea and Midway. However, they form an integral part of the story of the campaign in the Southwest Pacific, as the duel between the carrier forces of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet is vital to the success or failure in the South Pacific, not only in the Solomons but also in the parallel battle for New Guinea. Control of the air, and thus of the sea, was up for grabs in these battles. And though neither side was able to eliminate the carrier forces of the other, the losses incurred in these battles were decisive. In them, the remnants of the elite Japanese naval aviators were lost. After these battles, the Americans hold a clear advantage in carrier warfare. This is greatly amplified by the enormous American naval building program that would soon flood not only the Southwest Pacific, but the entire Pacific Ocean theater with dozens of carriers equipped with more and more advanced aircraft, flown by better trained and more experienced personnel. In the twin actions of Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, then, the Japanese made their last credible attempt to wrest control of the sea from the Americans. After their failure to do so, the most the Japanese Navy could do was make the American advance towards the home islands as costly as possible. This episode wraps up my account of the Dauntlesses' role in the Southwest Pacific. Next time, we'll take a look at its lesser-known use on the other side of the world, as part of the American forces sent to invade North Africa as part of the combined British-American Operation Torch. So I hope you'll join me for that. But before that, though, I'll be putting out a shorter episode detailing some of the specific aspects of the American war production program. This will involve the famous Oerlikon 20mm automatic cannon. Take a brief look at this iconic Swiss design, already one of the best in the world, and how it was improved and its production streamlined by American engineering and industry. So I hope you join me for that. In case I don't get that done in time, I'd like to take the chance to wish my listeners a happy holiday, whether you celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, or anything else, and I hope that it's merry and bright despite the difficulties imposed by the pandemic this year. Until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.